All right, so let's jump into a case that's had, I don't know, maybe more twists and turns than a season finale of, your favorite show. We're talking about the Jussie Smollett case. You probably remember it was back in 2019. Smollett, who you might know from the show Empire, claimed he was attacked in Chicago. And it was just this horrific incident that he said was both racist and homophobic. I mean, it was a story that grabbed headlines really all across the country. Then, in a move that shocked a lot of people, the charges were just dropped. Prosecutors agreed to this deal where Smollett did some community service and he forfeited his $10,000 bond and then just walked away. Seemingly no further consequences. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. There was huge public outcry. Special prosecutor was appointed. And Smollett faced a second indictment, a trial. And ultimately he was convicted. But then just when you thought it was over, the Illinois Supreme Court stepped in and they overturned that conviction. They cited a legal technicality. And that's actually what we're going to kind of untangle today. We're not here to debate whether or not Smollett was actually guilty or innocent. Instead, we're doing this deep dive into the legal reasoning behind the Supreme Court's decision and why it matters, even years after you know what happened. Now, at the heart of this decision is a legal term you might not be familiar with. It's called a nolle prosequi. It sounds really intimidating, but it basically just means that prosecutors are choosing to drop charges. But here's the thing, a nolle prosequi doesn't usually prevent them from refiling those charges later on, if they want to. So you might be wondering what made Smollett's case different. Well, the Illinois Supreme Court looked at all the details and decided that this wasn't a typical nolle prosequi. They actually determined that it was part of a binding agreement between Smollett and the state. He did his part, he did the community service and he forfeited the bond. So the court said the state was obligated to uphold their end of the bargain, which meant those charges were dropped for good. Now, the state actually argued against this. They said, hold on, simply forfeiting a bond isn't the same as giving up a fundamental constitutional right. They felt that this shouldn't prevent them from pursuing charges later. But the Supreme Court disagreed. They emphasized the importance of fairness. Fairness in the legal system. And their message is pretty clear. The state can't just go back on its word, even if the payment from the defendant wasn't a constitutional right. In Smollett's case, giving up that $10,000 was seen as a significant enough sacrifice for the agreement to be binding. And to kind of support this reasoning, they pointed to some previous cases, specifically Starks and Stupinski. And these cases illustrate this principle, this legal principle that the state really has to honor its agreements. They have to stick to their word. So that's kind of the background here, I think is important to set the stage. Before we dive into some of the nuances of this case and what it could mean, going forward, because there are a lot of questions about how this might affect, future cases. And what it says about the relationship between the state and defendants is a pretty complex situation. But I think it's really important to understand. So let's take a closer look at some of the arguments that were made in this case. And we'll try to unpack some of the implications, because this is something that could have far-reaching consequences. And it's definitely something that everyone should be aware of. It's interesting to think about the dissent in this case, too. During the initial appeal, one of Justices, Mrs. Lyle, actually predicted some of these concerns that we're talking about. And her argument was that if the state is allowed to just break these agreements, like it did in this case, it could really damage public trust in the legal system as a whole. And it does make you think, yeah, right? If you can't rely on a deal that you make with the legal system, what does that even say about the fairness of the whole process? And let's not forget the context here either. I mean, this wasn't just any minor offense or anything. Smollett was accused of faking a hate crime. And that's something that could have had, really serious consequences, far-reaching consequences. It's easy to see why people were so upset about this and why this case got so much attention. But here's the thing. The Supreme Court's role isn't to be swayed by public opinion or, the heat of the moment or anything like that. Their job is to uphold the law. And in this case, they felt that upholding the agreement with Smollett, regardless of how people felt about it, was the right legal decision. This case also kind of shines a light on the power that prosecutors have. Prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutors have a lot of leeway when they're deciding who to charge with a crime and what kinds of deals to offer. And they can even decide to drop a case completely. It's a huge responsibility. I think the Smollett case brings up some big questions about how those decisions get made and whether or not there's enough accountability when those decisions are questioned. So we've talked about the Supreme Court's decision, but you might be asking, what does this all mean for me, for the average person? Well, one thing is it really reinforces this idea that agreements with the state are serious business, whether it's a plea deal or a cooperation agreement, or even a situation like this with a nolle prosequi. Both sides have to stick to their word. They have to honor the agreement. It also brings up these important questions about how we balance public outrage with core legal principles. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the emotions of a high-profile case like this one. But the law has to operate based on rules, not just how people are feeling at any given moment. And that can be a tough thing to accept, especially when it feels like justice wasn't really served in certain cases. But here's another way to think about it. Could this ruling actually benefit defendants in the long run? Think about it this way. If the state knows it can't just back out of these agreements whenever it's convenient for them, it might lead to more carefully considered agreements from the start. Maybe there will be more transparency, more oversight, and in the end, a fair system for everyone involved. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen, but it's something to watch for sure. The Smollett case itself might be closed officially, but it started this conversation that goes way beyond just one guy and his legal troubles. It's a conversation about trust and fairness and making sure our justice system lives up to its name. Yeah, and that's why I think this case matters to everyone, even if you've never seen, Empire or have strong feelings about Jussie Smollett himself. It raises these questions about the balance between public pressure, legal principles, and how we get to justice. It's really fascinating. There's one more point from the Illinois Supreme Court's decision that I think is really important to highlight. They cited another case, Bowers v. State, and the quote they used is just so powerful. They said, "The public justifiably expects the state above all others to keep its bond." It's such a striking statement. They're basically saying the whole integrity of the justice system depends on whether the state can be trusted to do what it says it's going to do, to honor those commitments. And this brings me to what I think is a really crucial point for understanding the impact of this whole decision. This isn't just about Jussie Smollett. It's about setting a precedent. It's about creating a standard for how the legal system works, no matter who's involved. The Smollett case has been just a wild ride, full of these unexpected twists and turns. But this latest chapter with the Supreme Court's decision, that might be the most important one. It makes us really think about the limits of prosecutorial power and how important agreements are within the legal system, and that uncomfortable relationship between what the public thinks and the actual rule of law. These are questions we should all be thinking about long after the headlines fade away. So that wraps up our deep dive into this really complex and fascinating case. I hope this has given you some food for thought and maybe even sparked some conversations of your own. Thanks for joining me.